Good morning. Time now a few minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning on the Friday, June 9th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group Morning Seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize many online seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. This morning, we are featuring a very interesting new report titled Glaciers of the Himalayas, Climate Change, Black Carbon, and Regional Resilience, which was released on June the 3rd, about a month ago. With us connecting from Washington, we have a pleasure of having Muthukumara Mani, the lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia region, and the lead author of the Glaciers of the Himalaya report. Good morning, Mani. How are you? Good evening to you, actually. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Koichi. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, super. Mani presented another very interesting report on the impact of the climate change in South Asia, titled South Asia Hotspot in the Morning Seminar, held in October 2018. And this is his second appearance in our morning seminar program. I'd like to welcome back Mani to join us as a speaker in our program. We'll listen to Mani presenting the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. Following his presentation, as usual, I'll read your questions. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so even during this seminar using online form posted on the announcement page for this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. After Mani's presentation, I'll read your question and ask Mani to respond. With that, I'd like to ask Mani to come in and then start your presentation. Mani, over to you.
Thanks, Koichi. It's always a pleasure to present in Tokyo. I remember that I had presented the South Asia's hotspots a couple of years ago, and that it was well received, as you may know. And again, this report also has received a lot of attention. So yes, let me share my screen here. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Great. So I'm going to start this presentation in a rather unusual fashion, actually with a story. The picture that you see is a picture of Kumik village in Zanskar Valley of the Himalayas. This village was inhabited for centuries by people, and it was considered one of the highest and remotest village on the planet. And this was mainly an agrarian society, depending on cultivation of crops as well as kind of rising livestock. And then this village was shut off from the rest of the world for 6 months, but that was sufficient for them to survive. And this civilization that has survived for centuries, mainly depended on streams of water that they received from melting glaciers. But a few years ago, that stream that they were dependent on from glacier melt stopped. And obviously, for the people in Kumik village, that was the only means of sustenance, and so they had no other option but to leave. So this empty village that you see here is a testament to how glacier melt or retreating glaciers are impacting societies all over the world. In some sense, the residents of Kumik village became the very first climate refugees because they had to abandon their village and move elsewhere because they couldn't sustain their lives. So, in essence, what I'm trying to say is that the retreat of glaciers or glacier melt has consequences for not only for people in upstream villages, but people living downstream all over the region in terms of water security, food security, energy security, livelihood, and jobs. So there are probably millions of other kumiks out there which might be adversely impacted by the glacier melt that's happening because of climate change. And the worrisome part is that it's happening in the South Asia region, which is already becoming one of the world's scarcest region, water scarce regions, declining water tables because of groundwater depletion that's happening all around, and pretty much water crisis in many regions from time to time. So clearly, the glacier retreat has huge consequences for the South Asia region, which is already hugely water scarce. Another major factor associated with glacier retreat and glacier melt is the formation of glacial lakes. And what happens is that when the glacial lakes form and then they burst, it's called a glacier lake floods which threaten millions of people downstream. So these gloughs or glacial lake outburst floods actually could threaten not only people but also economies downstream in the years to come. And of course, along with water comes food, because agriculture in many parts of the region is highly dependent on the rivers, which originate in the glaciers or the Himalayan mountains. And obviously, glacier retreats and glacier melt has huge consequences for food security in this region. A number of countries in this region are now looking to hydroelectric power as a major source of energy, and also in some countries like Nepal and Bhutan as a source of economic security, economic prosperity. And also it is seen as a major source of clean energy to replace the dirty fossil fuel-based coal-fired energy that's the mainstay in many of the countries. But unfortunately, again, hydropower is seriously threatened by the melting glaciers or glacier retreat, clearly because the changing water flows, the patterns of water could significantly impact the production of hydropower in the downstream areas. And finally, of course, glaciers in the Himalayas and in the beautiful mountains are also major tourist destinations. And for example, in Nepal, almost 8% of the GDP depends on tourism. And clearly, if the glaciers start melting, there'll be fewer tourists going up there. And similarly, if there are more natural disasters happening, that may also deter people from going there, which in turn will impact the jobs of porters and other people related to tourism industry in these mountain communities. So basically, I'm kind of setting the stage in terms of how the glacier retreat or glacier melt could significantly impact the lives and livelihoods of people living not only in upstream areas like the Kumik village, but also in a number of downstream areas in the South Asia region. And because of this, again, people are trying to innovate. So this is a picture from the Ladakh region in India, where basically people are constructing what are called the glacier stupas. And basically what happened in this region, of course, is that because of glacier retreat, they're hardly getting any water in the spring. And similarly, summer months where actually they do most of their cultivation, they don't get any water at all. So some innovative kind of scientists came up with this idea to store glaciers in the form of these structures, which is now becoming a very popular way of storing water for the summer cultivation. So again, people are adopting to what they're seeing, which is that the glaciers are retreating and water availability is going down over the years. So glaciers of the Himalayas, just to give you a brief overview, it spans across 8 countries. It's also called the roof of the world because it contains 14 of the world's highest mountains. It's the largest ice structure beyond the 2 poles, so it's often called as the third pole. And also, of course, it's the water tower of Asia because a number of river systems originate in the glaciers, and they are basically lifeline for millions of and billions of people living downstreams. So historically, glacier melt is happening all over the world. But especially in the last 40 to 50 years, the glacier melt has accelerated. And mainly it can be traced to human activities. Mainly, of course, human activities leading to climate change, and which in turn is significantly impacting glacier melt. And when you talk of glacier melt, one usually talks of what's called the glacier mass loss. So because the glaciers are, you can say, they once they lose their mass, obviously they melt, right? And scientists, what they do is they try to understand what are the factors that lead to the glaciers losing their mass balance. And they are seeing that human activities have been increasingly responsible for the glaciers across the world losing their mass balance in the last 50 years. Another phenomenon that's actually being studied greatly, of course, is, as I mentioned before, the formation of the glacial lakes. And when the glaciers melt and retreat, they also lead to the formation of these glacial lakes. And the glacial lakes, beyond a certain point, they sometimes burst, resulting in glacial lake outbursts, floods, which again can cause huge damage downstream in the downstream areas. So again, there are a number of glaciers, number of river basins in this what called HK region, which is called Hindu Kush, Himalayan, and Karakoram region to elaborate. But I think the most important ones for the South Asia region are these 3 major basins, which are basically Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra. There are other regions that that are impacting the East Asia region, like Mekong, Yangtze, Yellow, and of course there are river basins impacted in the Central Asia region, like for example, Amu Darya, and so on and so forth. But for the purpose of this study, we focus mainly on the Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra. They are, as you can see here, pretty much they share a large percentage of the glaciated area, also in terms of number of glaciers, and also in terms of the rivers that originate in these 3 basins. So if one looks at what's happening to climate change in the South Asia region over the last 50 years or so, obviously temperatures are increasing in some areas more than the others. In some, it's as high as an average temperatures have gone up by 1.5 to 3 degrees. In some, it's 0.5 to 1 degrees. In some, there is no change. We don't see similar patterns in precipitation. More or less, the precipitation hasn't changed much. The patterns haven't changed much. Some areas are receiving less rain. Some areas are receiving more rain, but not as evident as we see in case of temperature increase. And similarly, if you look at the future climate projections in the region across different scenarios, obviously you see that there will be temperature increase, but that of course depends on how the countries deal with their carbon emissions in terms of their Paris Agreement commitments, whether they manage the climate well in terms of their commitments, or if the Paris commitments fail, then you get into what could be called as a carbon intensive scenario. But an interesting aspect of glacier melt that we actually bring to light in this report is the impact of black carbon. Now, there have been studies that have looked at the impact of climate change on glacier melt. It's reasonably straightforward. As temperatures increase, ice melts, and obviously you have kind of more waters flowing downstream, and eventually as glaciers retreat, you have less water flowing. But black carbon is basically, it's a anthropogenic air pollution that's created by human activities, which in turn goes, these particles get deposited in the glaciers, which in turn accelerates their glacier melt, which is also sometimes called as the albedo effect, where the reflectivity of glaciers goes down because of the deposition. And black carbon is generated by human activities, like, for example, biomass burning, forest burning. It comes from factories, it comes from diesel vehicles, and especially major activity in the South Asia region is, of course, is brick making. So brick kilns are also major sources of black carbon. And these are also often called as short-lived climate pollutants, SLCPs. And so they not only impact the glaciers, but they also impact the climate, not long-term, but short-term. And of course, since they're basically a form of air pollution, they also come with huge consequences for health of the people in the region. So again, as I mentioned before, there are various different sources of glaciers, of black carbon, but mainly they are coming from biomass burning for household cooking. You have diesel vehicles, you have factories and brick kilns, and sometimes open burning of agricultural fields, and so on and so forth. Although a lot of these activities happen at the ground level, but then a lot of these particles, they travel upwards, and then they get deposited in the glaciers, causing them to melt. So the main research question that we've wanted to ask in the study, of course, is that to what extent the black carbon reduction policies that will be undertaken by South Asian countries will impact glacier formation and glacier melt in the Hindu-Kush Himalayan range. So again, as I mentioned before, much of the previous attention has been on climate change, but this is the interesting angle that we wanted to bring. And the reason being that managing black carbon is within the control of the countries of the region, whereas climate change is, of course, is a global public good, and it depends on countries all over trying to deal with their respective greenhouse gas emissions. So again, the focus is on the Hindu-Kush Himalayan region, and the focus is on three major river basins, which is basically Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra. And then the three river basins, of course, they are different in the sense that in terms of population, Ganges and Brahmaputra are more heavily populated than Indus Basin. They all differ in terms of their upstream and downstream areas, in terms of precipitation, in terms of irrigated region, and so on and so forth. So clearly, it's kind of interesting to see how this phenomenon, which is pretty much the same across all of the region in terms of impact of black carbon on glaciers, but what's really interesting to see is how this is going to be impacting these three different river basins differently. And that's, I guess, you could say the main finding of the study in terms of doing a more granular analysis. And of course, one shouldn't forget the fact that, yes, countries in the South Asia region are dependent on these glaciated rivers, but also we should not forget the role of the monsoon, which is an important part of their water resources in the region. So clearly, again, most of the rain, as you probably know, in the South Asia region comes during the monsoon season. And of course, because of climate change, there's always a risk that these patterns of monsoon might also be affected. And also there is also now increasing evidence that increasing black carbon deposition, also aerosol deposition, also could impact the monsoon. So again, so when one wants to look at the water flows in the region, because that's what we are ultimately interested in, the water flows downstream is impacted by glacier melt, is impacted by snow melt, and also impacted by precipitation patterns. So when one wants to understand how a certain river basin like Indus or Brahmaputra or Ganges will be impacted by glacier melt, one should also take into account the fact that glacier melt is one of the components because these rivers are also fed by precipitation patterns and also snow melt patterns. So change in any of these three factors could significantly impact the overall runoffs in these basins. So what we did in this case was obviously we constructed a scientific model. And although I'm an economist, but this study took me out of my comfort zone because I had to deal with climate models, aerosol, chemistry models, and hydrological models. So what we did was we put together the climate models, which are more common, and we also modeled black carbon in the region. And then we basically, these were put together into a model which is called Conceptual Cryosphere Hydrology model, basically. So we fed the climate data and the black carbon data into this hydrology model to then assess how changing these factors will impact the hydrology, the basin hydrology in the region, and then how that will have local impacts and regional impacts. So this is the CCHF model. Again, it's a scientific hydrology model, which is just so many different elements to it, and it takes it could be run only in a supercomputer kind of framework because of the large amounts of data that's inputted into this framework. So one of the things that we had to do as a part of this analysis was to track the major sources of black carbon in the region, and not only the major sources of black carbon, but also there is also a seasonal element to black carbon. So, for example, as you can see here, there is more, you can say, black carbon that happens during January and into April, but then you don't see that much of black carbon happening around monsoon season. And again, you see the black carbon rates increase around October. Again, this could be to some extent because of the sources that are responsible for black carbon. And I'm told that usually the brick kilns that are a major source of black carbon in the region, they don't operate during the monsoon season because of the rain. So it could be that since most of the brick kilns in the region are shut down during the monsoon season, you don't see that much of black carbon happening around July. And in January, again, the region, some parts of the region get really cold. So a lot of people start using biomass, not only for cooking, but also for heating. And the result of it, you see, and people also burning, let's say, around in October time, you see more of crop burning happening in the region because of the harvesting season. So there is also a seasonal element to black carbon deposition in the region. And also, we had to, as a part of their black carbon modeling exercise, separate out the black carbon that originated within the region from the black carbon that comes out from outside the region. So, for example, some part of the black carbon comes from, for example, from China and also even from Central Asia. Which is about, you can say roughly about, it depends on the season. In some season, it's as high as 40%. Some season, it's as low as 15%. So what we did was we had to separate out for the model, as a part of the modeling exercise, the black carbon that's generated from within the South Asia region from the black carbon that comes from outside. And so when we basically developed this CCHF model, which has basically three elements, which is the climate modeling part, which is all the different climate scenarios. Then you have the black carbon modeling part with all the black carbon scenarios, and then that's fed into the hydrological model. And then the first step, of course, is to calibrate the model to make sure that it actually works for the historical period. So that's one of the first things that we did in terms of calibrating the model. Again, as I said before, this model it's run at a fairly granular level. So all these elements are done at a 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And that's why I said we need supercomputer to run this type of analysis. So once the model is calibrated, we then we wanted to validate the model for the historic period. We chose 1985 to 2015 as the historic period for the entire Hindu Kush Himalayan region to make sure that the model works and the results that it produces are actually closer to the results that we observe in the real world. So although the model was calibrated and validated for the 1985 to 2015 timeframe, but for the focus of the analysis, we decided to take the decade, the closest decade, which is 2000 to 2010, as the base case for our analysis. So if you take the baseline observation, that makes it then easier for us to compare our future projections, which goes up to 2040s, and how that compares with the baseline. So as you can see here in the baseline, this is the annual precipitation. This is what we see as annual runoffs. And then we have the contribution of glacier melt, snow melt, and rainfall across the three basins. And also one of the things that we wanted to make sure, given that we are dealing with highly complex scientific modeling here, we want to make sure that the numbers that we are getting are right or within the ballpark that comes from other studies. So we basically compare our analysis with two other kind of landmark studies. One is the Lutz and Emerzeel, and one was Armstrong. And we just wanted to make sure that the model works and the results that we produce are more or less in the same ballpark. And that gave us some kind of confidence that if it works for historical data, it will also work for when we start making the future projections. Again, we wanted to compare our kind of historic results with that of the other two studies. And basically, our study results kind of fell between the two studies because we felt that the Armstrong study really understated the role of glaciers, whereas the Lutz study actually suggested that the glaciers are more important. Again, these were conducted using different methodologies, different time frames, but more or less, again, we felt that our study was kind of fell in between. Our study results fell in between these two studies. That gave us some comfort that we are not too off the mark, too much off the mark. Again, we see that these are the three major contributions of water production: the snow melt, glacier melt, and precipitation patterns. And then obviously we see that there's significant variation across the three river basins in the entire region. Now, we also wanted to simulate how the black carbon policies will impact glacier melt. At the end of the day, we wanted to study what is it that countries can do to manage black carbon, given that climate change is not really under their control. It's much of a global phenomenon. So we had two scenarios for black carbon, managing black carbon. One is the historical black carbon, and then one is what the countries are trying to do now to manage black carbon. And countries are taking steps. For example, there are programs in countries to shift people away from using biomass cooking stoves for cooking to make them use cleaner cook stoves. In India, there's a big program to move people to LPG. There is now a major shift to move towards electric cars in some of these countries to move, get the diesel vehicles out of the way. And these policy changes are happening, but they're slow. So we wanted to study what's going to be the impact of these existing policies on black carbon emissions. And we found that if fully implemented, which is highly ambitious because obviously it's easy to enact policies, but difficult to implement them, especially in a region as complex as South Asia. But if you assume that the current policies for dealing with diesel vehicles, for black carbon, for dealing with brick kilns are enacted, the black carbon deposits will be reduced by 20%, 23% by 2040s. But then we simulated a scenario where actually the black carbon deposits could be reduced by as high as 50%. And then we basically wanted to see how that will impact the glacier melt and also the water production downstream. So these are the basically two scenarios. One is the current policy scenario, and then what we call as a mitigation scenario. We wanted to study to see if countries are actually more proactive in dealing with black carbon, what will be the impact of glacier melt. So we compare these two scenarios, the standard scenario, which is the current policies, and then the mitigation scenarios. And then basically the model tells you what will be the contribution from glacier melt, what will be the contribution from snow melt, what will be the contribution from rainfall runoff to the total runoff, which in turn will determine your agricultural downstreams, your hydropower downstream, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that you can see here is that if you take the mitigation scenario and compare that with the standard scenario, you see obviously that the glacier melt is reduced in the mitigation scenario compared to this standard scenario because of the black carbon reduction policies. So overall, although in terms of the percentage, this looks small, but overall we see that it has significant impact on the runoffs. And so what we're trying to see here is that actually, and if you take the standard case, you see that the glacier melt obviously increases compared to the baseline. So just to illustrate, so you basically have to compare these numbers with the baseline, right? Which is now, let's say, 4%, 3%, and 10%. Now, under the standard case, it becomes 11%, 5%, and 16%, whereas under the mitigation case, it goes only up to 9%, 4%. So if you compare the baseline with the standard and mitigation case, you can see that the mitigation scenario is much better off in terms of the runoffs. And so one could potentially stabilize the glacier melt to the current rates through the mitigation scenario. And obviously, the technology is there in terms of shifting people from, let's say, the dirtier cook stoves to cleaner cook stoves. It's not difficult. Shifting people away from diesel vehicles is not difficult. Converting brick kilns to use modern technology is not difficult. So the technology is there. Nothing needs to be reinvented. But only thing is countries need to be more proactive in implementing these policies. So again, as we see here, if you compare the basins, clearly the mitigation scenario obviously is kind of better off in terms of the runoffs. So what are the key kind of findings of this report? As I mentioned before, under the existing policies, the black carbon deposition will go down by about 23% in 2040s, but there is potential to reduce them by 50%. by enacting some new policies, by countries being more proactive in moving towards cleaner technology in a number of these areas. And so clearly, that has the implementation of this or being more proactive in managing black carbon will have significant economic benefits across the three river basins. Especially because the water flow is more or less reasonably stabilized, and you don't get into some of the downside effects of glacier melt that a lot of these communities are witnessing. And in the broader context of South Asia, this is kind of an interesting finding in the sense that for the first time, we are actually linking air pollution with water resource management, which has not been done before. What we are saying is that, yes, people have been talking about air pollution as a major problem in South Asia, but more as a local problem, dealing with air pollution at a city level. But what we are finding here is that air pollution is actually a regional problem, because it's not only impacting your health of the population in your cities and towns and communities, but actually air pollution is also traveling, it's impacting climate change, it's impacting glacier melt, and in turn it's impacting water resources. And obviously when we start talking about this as a more of a regional issue, this also brings into focus how countries can work together in order to deal with black carbon. Because when you talk about black carbon, it's also sometimes called as the Asian brown cloud. So it is not something that's specific to one country, because the pollution particles, they don't see any country boundaries, they travel across the country. So clearly, it doesn't matter where the brick kilns are located, or where people are using the dirty cook stoves, or where there are more diesel vehicles, because at the end of the day, these pollution particles are traveling across the countries. So it's a regional problem, and countries have to deal with it effectively, or can effectively deal with it only if they get together. So the bottom line is, yes, countries, the glacier melt or glacier retreat is a regional problem. But also linked to it is the problem of air pollution. And so it is therefore necessary for countries to get together to deal with this problem jointly. And as I said before, managing black carbon is critical because it has implications for water resources, which has implications for livelihoods, which has implications for energy security, which has implications for food security. So potentially we can think of this as multiple wins if actually countries can get together and solve this problem. Not only are they could deal with local air pollution, they can also deal not only with glacier melt, but also the downstream implications, and the benefits could be in terms of food security, energy security, water security, and livelihoods for the population downstream. But at the same time, one should not ignore the fact that, yes, climate change is happening, and that's much of a global phenomenon, which is also causing the glaciers to melt. So one of the things that I think we should be careful is that, yes, we are saying that black carbon is also responsible, which in turn also shifts the burden to some extent to the region. But at the same time, climate change is a big issue for South Asia region. And so I think the stakes are even more higher for South Asia region to come together actually and to try to push for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions globally. again, as I said before, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. There are technologies out there for improving the efficiency of brick kilns. For example, what happened was in Nepal after the earthquake, there were a number of brick kilns that were totally destroyed. And one thing they started doing when they started to reconstruct the brick kiln was to obviously retrofit these brick kilns with new technologies. So the earthquake happened, but then it also provided them to rebuild the brick kilns to more efficient, less polluting ones. So clearly the technologies out there, but in many countries of the region, brick kilns are not even regulated. They are not even considered as formal industries. So clearly they're not subject to the same environmental standards as a regular industry. Transition to cleaner cook stoves has been around for a long time. There are many donor agencies that have pushed clean cook stove initiatives. But I think it's also not only one, and they find is that a lot of times people are given cleaner cook stoves to replace their older, dirtier cook stoves. But then if you go back after 6 months, you see that they have switched and they are they're gone back to using their older cook stoves or older methods of cooking, either because they feel that the food tastes better in older methods, or because sometimes the cleaner cook stoves that are given to them, something goes wrong with them, and there's nobody in their respective villages to fix this, so they go back to their old ways. So again, it is not just a question of giving them subsidized clean cook stoves or free cook stoves, but I think it's also a change of mindset that is really needed to switch people from dirtier ways of cooking, which is still very high percentage in South Asia, to cleaner cook stoves. The example of Kumik village again highlights how vulnerable these mountain communities are. We saw a lot of times people living downstream, we don't really think about the people living upstream. But then there are people, millions, if not billions of people living upstream in these mountain communities. For them, the main source of water is coming from the glacier. So clearly, we need to think about mountain communities. We need to think about how do we sustain these mountain communities? How do we make sure that the Kumik's example is not repeated elsewhere? Similarly, another issue that's associated with glaciers, of course, as I mentioned before, is gloughs, which pose a serious threat to the region. There are, at this point, maybe hundreds of gloughs all around South Asia, which are at the risk of being bursting anytime, causing huge damage. Even, I think, a couple of months ago, there was a glough happened in India, which caused humongous damage. So clearly, we need to make sure that, or at least map where the gloughs are, and to make sure that one could potentially stabilize where possible, or move people to other places where necessary. And similarly, a lot of countries in South Asia that are potentially banking on hydropower as a way to, as a major source of clean energy, or as a way of economic prosperity, they need to be careful because the glacier melt will have huge implications for hydropower. And so when it's now important for these countries to plan ahead and to make sure that when they actually plan a certain hydropower, maybe they need to do some kind of analysis to make sure that the water flows 30, 40 years from now will be the same as what it is now, because there is always a risk that things could change because of glacier melt. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amani, for your presentation. We received some questions from our viewers in advance, and then I just received another set of questions from the viewers currently watching the seminar. So let me read the questions that we received in advance and then ask you to respond. First one, and the question from Tanaka-san, thank you for your question. Would this analysis calling for policies to reduce black carbon be applicable for other glaciers outside the Himalayas? That's the first question. Mani, please.
That's a very good question. So again, it depends, because we have done analysis for South Asia where we found that black carbon is a major issue for the Himalayan glaciers. But I think one needs to study more in terms of the other parts of the world, because there is now evidence that climate change is a major factor for reducing or causing glaciers to melt all over in the world. But black carbon may not be an issue in some other parts of the world where people have already switched to cleaner methods of cooking, or the transportations are much more cleaner. Because South Asia, as you know, is also a hotspot of air pollution. But there are many parts of the world which are a lot cleaner, which have already dealt with the air pollution problem. So I think the issue needs to be studied more carefully. I think I would definitely, if I were to do this analysis, I think the next region that probably where we could study this, of course, is the Central Asia region, which is again where the water dependent region, and then again could be a region interesting to study.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses. Next two questions are the question that we received from the same anonymous participant. Let me read each one of them. First one, how do you encourage the leaders in South Asia countries, including those at the state or local levels, to further implement policies for reducing black carbon deposition? Governments are typically facing with financial challenges and may need additional assistance in this regard, in addition to shifting existing resources for this purpose. Mani, please.
Thanks again. Good question. So what we do when we prepare these reports in the World Bank, of course, is that we try to make a convincing argument, an economic argument that will appeal to the policymakers, and that's the only way we try to convince the policymakers that the economic benefits of enacting a certain policy is more than the cost. And that's one way to convince. For example, in terms of air pollution, again, clearly, people talk about the health benefits or human benefits that are saving lives, and that could be one area where one can focus on. But the problem is that the climate change or glacier melt, these are all long-term challenges. But policymakers are focused on their electoral cycles, which are much more short-term, 3 to 5 years. So clearly, I think that's the main factor. But at the most, what we can do is to make an economic case saying that all these practices are not economically sustainable. And that's what, and hope that the leaders are convinced.
Great. Thank you. Before moving into the second part of the question from the same participant, Mani, would you please move a little bit your microphone up, because your microphone is hitting your shirt actually, so we can hear the sounds. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Great. Okay, let me continue reading the second part of the question. Regional cooperation. You mentioned the regional cooperation as an effective transboundary solution. Generally, South Asia is often mentioned as one of the least integrated regions. Would you please elaborate a bit more on what form of regional integration is needed in this context? Should existing mechanisms such as SARC would be sufficient, or a new form is needed? How would the World Bank help South Asia countries to encourage regional cooperation in this regard? How would the World Bank, ADB, and JICA, three major donors in the region, collaborate in this regard? Mani, please.
Yes, you're right. The South Asia region probably is one of the least integrated regions in the world, especially in terms of economic, political cooperation. But I think one area where countries can actually start working together is climate change. I think it's a win-win situation, because this is a challenge that cuts across countries, and so it actually. So, for example, when we were actually working on this study, we held a workshop in Nepal a couple of years ago, and where we brought various policymakers, technical people together, and then we created a glacier and mountain economy platform where basically we and it was actually led by the government of Nepal, that this is probably one area where countries can actually benefit from cooperation, and they can set aside their political and other differences, and precisely because the benefits of cooperation are huge. And also uh, the cooperation, when you talk of cooperation, regional cooperation, it is not just should happen at the political level, but it could happen at the level of the researchers, academic community, and so on and so forth. So especially we feel that in this area, a lot can begin actually by researchers getting together, started sharing information and knowledge about glaciers, about black carbon. Because right now, for example, a lot of research is going on glaciers in Nepal, in India, in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. But then it would be ideal if these researchers can actually work together so that they have a common understanding of how glacier retreat or glacier melt is happening. And similarly, on black carbon, it's again a regional issue. So researchers, so I think one can actually build a regional cooperation from bottom up. Start with the researchers, then you start bringing the technical people together, and then eventually that may lead to some kind of a policy dialogue at the high level.
Thank you for your responses. Let me read the two questions and comments that we received from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much for your question and comment. How much the economic impact would be in the region in terms of GDP reduction by the glacier impact? That's the first set of the comment. And second one, in order to keep the current current state of the glacier and water level, would current goal to reduce CO2 targeting to 2050 be too slow? What would be your recommendation in this regard? Mani, please.
Thanks. Again, a good question. So one interesting thing that you'll probably notice in this report is that there isn't much economics in it. And which, as I said before, this was kind of taking me out of my comfort zone, because as an economist, you would like to do some economic analysis. But then what we decided when we started working on this analysis, because obviously this was a highly complex modeling exercise where we had the climate models, we have the black carbon models, we had the hydrological model. So we decided that it may be best to actually work on the science first, and then the scientific results that have come out of this analysis now can be used by economists to analyze how this will impact hydropower generation, or how this will impact agriculture, how this. So we did not do any analysis, economic analysis, but we see that this report can now be taken up further by others, economists in the region, to analyze either specific sectors or specific countries, and so on and so forth. Definitely, the climate targets for 2050 clearly are not sufficient right now. I think right now the Paris commitments, from what I understand, are more geared towards a 3-degree world by the end of the century, as opposed to 1.5 degree. And we haven't really seen a whole lot of commitments from countries to decarbonize, which is so important. So yes, in addition to countries being more proactive in their own black carbon management policies, it's definitely dealing climate change targets should become more ambitious across the world.
Thank you, Mani. You responded to all the questions that we received in a very effective manner. So before wrapping up the seminar, I'd like to ask you to give us a very final remarks as a co-author of the report, and then we conclude the seminar.
Thanks. So again, I think this report should serve as a wake-up call for the countries in the region, the sense that they need to start paying more attention to black carbon, because it's not only a local issue, but it's also a regional issue, which is impacting a glacier melt, which is subsequently going to impact their future water resources. And so hopefully, if, as I mentioned before, if the regional platform that was created a couple of years ago in Nepal, if we're hoping that if that could be somehow revived through this report, and countries can actually start coming together, at least at the academic level, the technical level to begin with, I think that will be a great contribution, I think, of this report. And again, I would really be happy if this report is taken forward by others to actually then now start putting some numbers on the table in terms of the economic impacts, because this analysis can now be easily fed into a CGE model or any kind of econometric model to assess the impact, broader economic impacts. And definitely that's something that could be done going forward.
Thank you very much. With us this morning from Washington was the Makutumara Mani, the lead economist in the office of the chief economist for South Asia region, and the lead author of the new report, Glacier of the Himalayas. Mani, thank you very much for your time joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Great. We'll continue organizing our morning seminars in a virtual format, and please check our website for the latest information, as we are now in the final stage of cooking up several sessions to be held in July and August. With that, I'd like to thank once again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next time. Thank you very much.